I'm Director of Education at Sanam S4, and I'm based here in Delhi. I'm joined by three colleagues from across the sector who have extensive experience in handling a variety of challenges and issues that come up in international education. I'd just like to very briefly introduce Enzo Ramo, who is someone who needs no introduction to many people in our sector. He's currently Chief Relationship Officer at Unilodges, an adjunct professor at Nanjing University, and has recently been Pro Vice Chancellor International at the University of Reading. I'm also joined by Christopher Cook, who is the Manager for International Travel, Health and Safety at Cornell University in the US, and finally by Doug Clow, who has been the Open University and also the University of York. So we have colleagues from both the UK and the US joining us this evening. We are just going to give a very short introduction to this session, and then I will hand over to Enzo. Firstly, I just wanted to set the context. India is globally the second largest source market for international students and a key part of many institutional strategies. Back in January, when we first started to see what has now developed into the current situation we have, when the coronavirus was first being mooted in the media, India was seen as potentially the way to fill the gap that was starting to come out in terms of the impact of China struggling with the virus. By mid-February, it was clear that the virus was spreading in ways that we hadn't necessarily anticipated, and India was not going to be that straightforward solution to the drop in numbers from China, in the challenges that we were facing with mobility, recruitment, and all sorts of partnership developments in China. So India currently has about 60 cases of virus that's been confirmed, but that is changing. It's a very dynamic situation, as it is in many markets. And we've had one state this morning declare a state of emergency. So in India, it is fast-moving and one that is being monitored very closely by us here at Sanam S4. The object of this evening's webinar is to discuss with colleagues, to share ideas, best practice, to how we can respond to the challenges, the global challenges. So it's not just about India, but about everything that's developing across the globe, and how we can respond to those challenges in a planned and proactive way. That will be the key to managing the impact on our institutions and on student experience and the staff experience that we offer across the globe. So that's the context in which we are looking at this evening, and I'm going to now ask Enzo to take the first section and hand over to him to share his thoughts on strategic responses and operational readiness and learning lessons from previous challenges in this area. Okay, Enzo, I'm going to hand over to you now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Julia. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to join this seminar. Next slide, please. I'm going to try and cover three things quite briefly over the next few minutes. I'm going to start with some context setting, then say something about the planning around SARS in 2003, and then end with a few observations as well as a few suggestions for consideration. Obviously, I don't have any easy answers, but I hope that I might be able to help in raising some questions for us all to think about and perhaps discuss later on. Next slide. Among the many challenges we face with COVID-19 and in having this discussion today is that to a large degree we're going to be speculating about what might happen, what the impact of the virus might be in different scenarios and in different countries, both sending and host countries. And of course, increasingly countries fall into both categories by recruiting large numbers of students from overseas, as well as sending large numbers to other countries for some or all of their higher education. Those of us in the UK and the USA today have, to some extent, the advantage of having seen how Australian universities have been impacted at the start of their academic year and how they've been trying to manage the situation. But we don't know a huge amount. A few things that we do know is that the situation is changing daily, perhaps it's even changing by the hour. That universities across the world, and certainly in the 3 main English-speaking destinations for international students, have already been impacted and will continue to be impacted for an undefined period. And that universities need to be planning and already implementing plans for a range of different scenarios that may affect them and their communities. Next slide. It's quite clear that Australian universities were unprepared for the impact of the virus on student recruitment and in turn on their financial health. And like many universities in the UK and some in the US, hadn't learned the lessons from earlier events, including the Southeast Asian economic downturn in the late 1990s, which saw international student numbers dip quite considerably, or SARS in 2003, where UK universities at least had started to see growth from China and had to plan quickly in case of shortfalls in student arrival. And more recently, in different circumstances in Australia and the UK, which had a severe impact on international student intake from India. Many universities, particularly those in the UK and Australia, have both been over-reliant on international student income in general, and in particular, many have been overexposed to China or to a smaller number of markets for a healthy approach to risk management. If nothing else, COVID-19 might lead universities to reevaluate their risk appetites and their exposure to international students. But I think that's a discussion for another day. Of course, 17 years on from SARS, the recruitment environment has changed hugely. And in my view, universities are now much better placed to manage student recruitment in challenging circumstances than they were in 2003. For example, many more universities today have in-country offices than they did in 2003. I was told earlier today that there are more than 100, possibly up to 200 university offices in India. Agent channels have grown and have become more sophisticated, and those agent relationships are even more important in difficult times. They're your people on the ground, especially if you don't have your own in-country office, and should be a valuable source of intelligence. And thinking about that, I just wonder how many universities have included agents in their scenario planning group. And of course, web and other communication tools make it much easier to stay in touch and conduct business at a distance than was the case in 2003. So overall, I wouldn't waste too much time trying to dust off plans from 2003 to adapt to 2020. We have many more tools at our disposal today. But there's perhaps just one exception that I would think about, at least from my 2003 plan. One of the options we considered at Nottingham for helping to mitigate student shortfalls in the UK because of travel restrictions in 2003 was to take advantage of our overseas campus. Back in 2003, there weren't that many overseas campuses, but Nottingham already had a well-developed campus in Malaysia and was getting ready to launch a new campus in China, both with a broad subject offering. Now, even if you don't have your own campus, you'll have partner institutions, and I would suggest that it'd be worth looking at how you might support students who can't come to your home campus, but might be able to travel to an institution's overseas campus or partner. I think this is a more realistic scenario for more universities today than would have been the case in 2003. Those with overseas campuses and other forms of TNE have the additional headache today of managing the implications of COVID-19 in multiple locations, but at the same time, they might also have the option to better protect themselves from the consequences of student shortfalls in one location by risk spreading. Next slide, please. As the title of this webinar suggests, we still haven't reached the peak recruitment season in India. many students heading to the UK and to the USA haven't yet finished high school or their bachelor's degrees. It's clear, though, that if exam results are delayed, if the virus spreads in India, then the pressure will be on to delay the start of the new academic year in the UK and the USA. That pressure will already be on now if exam results are delayed in China, as seems reasonably likely. And of course, examination timetables may also be hit in the UK in the coming days or weeks. I certainly wouldn't be one to bet against a delay to the start of the 2020-21 academic year in the UK or the USA. Now, in some senses, if there's a delay to exam results in India, the USA is in a better position than the UK and Australia, at least in India, and at least for new undergraduate students, as offers of admissions will, in most cases, already be confirmed, whereas the dominant system in the UK is to make offers of admission conditional upon examination results, both high school and often English language test results. If these aren't available, and if universities don't want to delay the start of the new academic year, they'll need to be more flexible in assessing students' readiness for academic study, and should perhaps consider what additional in-sessional support might be needed for new starters. Now, I'm sure that other speakers will talk about distance learning as a way of keeping students warm if they can't travel, and if there's a delay to the start of the new year. It's incredible to me how many universities seem to have so easily switched to online learning delivery. But I have to admit to being a bit sceptical about this being an option longer term. In my experience, good distance learning can't just be easily switched on and takes time and a lot of resource to do properly. In any case, online learning isn't a solution for everyone and can't replace the on-campus experience which international students are paying for. And nor is it possible for all disciplines or for all types of students, for example, lab-based PhDs. The big advantage we have when it comes to India is that your Year 12 results are out much earlier than their UK equivalents. So a delay in India may not be that problematic for the UK, but it would be for Australian universities who we know are pushing very hard in India now to fill places for their second semester start dates to meet shortfalls from the start of the year. Of course, as universities, we can be flexible as we like, but we'll need the support of our immigration and visa authorities. Universities need to be lobbying now, as I'm sure they must be, for the immigration authorities to be putting contingency plans in place for dealing with later peak applications and being more flexible than they might otherwise be on some of the processes and documentation needed. Now, obviously, I can't do this webinar without saying something about the implications for student accommodation. In an interview for a US podcast earlier this week, I was asked if there might be a shortage of accommodation for new students, if more students have to stay on campus because they were unable to finish courses this academic year or haven't been able to return home. I personally think that's an unlikely scenario, and the experience from Australia is that there are more accommodation vacancies as a result of new students not arriving. In any case, in the UK and the USA, we should be able to make use of the summer vacation for any teaching or exam and catch-up. It's nevertheless a scenario we should be considering and developing a plan for managing. But talking about accommodation needs for existing students reminds us that the current situation we're facing isn't a Chinese student recruitment problem. It's not even an international student issue. COVID-19 is impacting all of our students, all of our staff, and the communities in which we live and work. Ensuring that we deal with our current students properly is vital in itself, but is also a signal to future students. Above all, we need to show the students who are studying with us today, from wherever they come, our care and support. Some will be frightened and concerned for their families in affected areas. And of course, their families and friends will also be worried about them so far from home. Regular good communication from universities, and ideally also from relevant health authorities, is vital and needs to target not just students and staff, but also their local communities and of course partners, agents, alumni and friends too. Very briefly, just to sum up, this is fast changing and we need to plan for multiple scenarios. Be flexible in your approach. Make use of your partners and especially those agents. Consider if T&E can help. Additional in-sessional support may be needed next academic year. Don't forget about what you need to do during the year for new arrivals. Universities can't manage this by themselves. They need help from immigration authorities. Start your lobbying now. Remember that this isn't just an international student recruitment issue. Make sure that you have proper care and support for your existing students. And communication needs to remember your wider communities, including families, partners, agents, alumni, etc. And of course, when this is all over, don't forget to learn lessons and review your approach to risk and the reliance we have on international students. Thank you very much.
The excellent assessment of opportunities that people have got to address the challenges that we face. And I remember SARS too. I can't believe it was it was that long ago. I'm now going to ask Chris if he could join us and take us through some of the areas that he specialises in, particularly now drilling down into how we can support our stakeholders, as Enzo said, staff, students, alumni, parents, by good planning, good communications, and thinking forward. So, Chris, I'll hand over to you if that's okay.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. So thanks everybody for taking the time out of your hectic day, hectic evening. I think those two things are blending together a little bit more the last couple weeks. Next slide, please. So I was asked to speak to higher education's response to incidents abroad with a particular focus on COVID-19, naturally. And so I thought I would talk through these pieces of a response, the monitoring, benchmarking, tracking, and so forth, as major considerations and actions that go into a response to an international crisis. Now, of course, there's generally not an order to these. A lot of them happen simultaneously and repeatedly, but I will try and go through them in somewhat of a linear fashion to make some overall sense of them. Next slide, please. So to begin with, as we start to hear of an incident in its beginnings, we want to reach out and start monitoring local news, monitoring those trusted sources, some of the obvious sources such as the CDC, the WHO, maybe in my case, the US Department of State, advisories and warnings. But I suggest that we don't forget about looking at other nations' state departments or travel offices, such as the UK's FCO office, where we can get different vantage points and different opinions than we might see coming from our own governments or our own intelligence sources. Another area to monitor would be intelligence providers. I think many institutions, particularly higher ed, have access to one of these paid for service intelligence providers like International SOS, World Aware, On Call. But if your institution or organization maybe doesn't have the means to partner or contract with someone like this, there's always the Overseas Security Advisory Council, which is a State Department function, at least for the US organization, which could be accessed for free. We also don't want to forget about benchmarking and monitoring what our peers are doing. I think in almost every situation, and no doubt in this situation, one of the first questions I'm asked is, what are our peers doing? So as a full-time international travel health and safety manager, I am eligible to be part of an organization called Pulse. And anyone in higher education that has a position like this actually would be eligible to be a member of Pulse. And it's an organization composed of about 120, 125 individuals at 70 plus US institutions that have a full-time job monitoring and responding to international travel incidents that affect their communities and populations. And it's an invaluable resource. One that obviously not many institutions have, but one that maybe would be worth arguing for, because we share resources, expertise, and benchmark off one another. But even if that's not a possibility, I would suggest it's very important to know who your peers are, as that's going to be one of those first questions that comes in. So in my case at Cornell University, the Ivy League schools, or the Ivy Plus, which are Ivy League schools plus a few that have a similar composition or public profile, are considered our peers. And it's a smaller subset. And to be able to identify who your peers are and benchmark quickly against them will help provide guidance for senior leadership to make decisions and move the incident response forward. Another item to benchmark would be looking at trends. When this first started, I know many institutions, including my own, were looking to the CDC for level changes. Are they going to level 2? Are they going to level 3? At what number of confirmed cases was that happening? And while that seems to have become a little less reliable lately as we look at numbers increasing throughout Europe, it still might be a benchmark or a trigger for your institution. But there are others. The Department of State advisory changes, maybe airlines canceling flights would be a good indicator to make important decisions on suspension or messaging as travel options might become more limited. Keeping an eye on entrance bans has helped head off a few uncomfortable situations in our case. Knowing that certain foreign nationals are not allowed into certain countries has allowed us to be proactive in outreach to those individuals to see what kind of support they might need or that we could provide. Next slide, please. I always think first and foremost for any kind of response, any reasonable and responsible response, you have to have some sort of registry to know where your travelers are and when they're going to be there. It's hard to do much of anything without knowing that. Many institutions that have study abroad offices use a software or study abroad application management software called Teradata, which has a travel registry component that can be used and is built in, which makes it somewhat seamless between the study abroad applications and a travel registry. But there's also many other options. At Cornell, ours is homegrown. Or you might even engage your travel assistance provider if you have one like International SOS to set up that travel registry. And then of course, there's always the good old spreadsheet where you just have people record where they're going and when they're going. But it's always important to define who you're tracking. Is it just business travel? What defines business travel? Is that funded, facilitated, supported? All three? Are you tracking business travel? And inevitably, someone will ask, what about domestic travel? So those are items and things to consider with your senior leadership as you put those in place. In terms of messaging, I think in this case and in all incidents, we tend to do a lot of messaging, a lot of different messaging. And I would say for Cornell and the COVID-19 messaging, we started out maybe a little too light. And then as things ramped up, we got rather heavy in our messaging. And one thing that I'm taking away from this experience is to track that a little bit better. I think it's important to know when you sent what and to who, so that you could refer back to it, pull from it, and not repeat messaging over and over and over that might just over message your travelers. I think it's important to understand that individual units are anxious to get their own word out. So that might be the colleges or other programs or offices running study abroad or overseeing travel. And it would be helpful to be proactive in letting them know what the institution is sending out and drive home the point of being consistent to mitigate some of that confusion that just results in more phone calls and more emails that you must respond to. Next slide, please. So decision-making and forecasting. It's very important to know who's making the decisions. Know where you are on that chain of command and where you can contribute to that. At Cornell and many higher ed institutions, I'm sure many private organizations, there are sub-teams. There's the teams that maybe respond to appeals to travel bans or appeals or exceptions to new rules being put in place throughout an incident response. And then there's maybe a higher level team, which we would call the incident management team, that provides advice at a higher level to the decision makers for the institution. And those are all functional team members from different organizational units. I would represent in my institution international travel, but we would also have student campus life on that team and emergency management on that team, facilities, and they would all report up to the decision makers, which at our institution would be provost, vice president, president level. It's important to also know, what are the decisions based on? Are there existing plans in place that would help guide your decisions or the advice that you're providing? Are those plans being updated, as they should be, once lessons are learned from an incident and from a response? Again, benchmarking against peers. Someone's going to ask, what are our peers doing? And that's going to inform the decision. And if not from a always practical standpoint, it's certainly from an optics standpoint. We don't want to be the last organization or the last institution who's making a decision that everyone else has already made. So, because parents and other stakeholders will zero in on that. They're going to ask, why are they doing this and you're not doing this? And it's good to have an answer for that, or to know that you're headed in that direction. It's also very important to establish triggers. You know, is CDC going to be your trigger at level 2, at level 3? Are airline cancellations going to be your trigger for certain decisions? Maybe it's the State Department. I would suggest that you make sure that that remains as consistent as possible in an ever-changing situation. I understand that can be difficult, but if you say we're abiding by CDC standards and then halfway through switch to a different standard, it gets confusing for people to understand what they're being expected to do and when they're being expected to do it. And knowing your risk tolerance is another thing that would be wise. Every institution, every organization has a different risk tolerance in terms of when they're going to react to a particular set of incidents or triggers. And although this can shift from time to time, depending on the situation, there tends to be some sort of level that you can pick up on by seeing past responses to incidents, but also speaking to those that are making the decisions. You know, the question might be, do you tend to pull everyone out of a country when something happens, or let the people in country decide if they want to stay? That's a huge indicator of what your institution's risk tolerance might be. And then, of course, you always want to think about the next travel period. In terms of higher ed, students are always thinking about graduation and the path to graduation. And so they might be willing to work with you while they're abroad or while they're going through something right now, but they need to know what's going to happen next so that they can continue on that plan and make accommodations for that plan. And you don't want, well, you just want to be clear on that. Next slide, please. And then capabilities and responsibilities. Throughout all of this, you need to take into consideration what your institution can actually provide. Decisions and promises will be driven by what you can realistically give back. If you make a decision to pull everyone back from a position abroad, can you give them accommodation on campus? In this particular case, we're running into the end of the semester. So the institution has to decide, can we provide academic accommodations to let students fulfill that semester by bringing them home? And every institution is going to be different in what those capabilities are. And then finally, responsibilities. We're running into state and federal compliance with quarantines. Should someone be quarantined? When should they be quarantined? What should that quarantine look like? But also from an optics perspective, in contrast to the compliance, there's the idea of protecting the local community. You know, and that leads into not only quarantine, but are you allowing visitors from outside in? Are you holding large events? And so I think with that and all of these pieces of the puzzle, one just has to work through it with your own organization as well as the incident at hand. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Chris, and those insights into and how you structure and approach and analyse the challenges have been really insightful. Thank you so much. I'm now going to ask Doug Clow to do his session. Doug has recently contributed to Wonky in the UK, which is something that UKHE are very familiar with. Comes out every Monday morning, keeps us all up to date on what's been happening in the higher education world in the UK. So Doug is going to look at some of the much more practical and sort of ways in which we can manage what's happening on campuses on a day-to-day basis. So Doug, I'm going to hand over to you now. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. Very kind, the very kind introduction, and I'm delighted to be here. My name's Doug Clow, and my main background is in learning and technology and online learning, and I'm a data science consultant, but I do have a healthcare background. My PhD's in biochemistry, and I've done a lot of work in teaching in healthcare informatics and that sort of thing, and doing a lot of strategic work. So I now find myself spending a lot of time on this virus, and particularly on the practical and the psychological things you can do to prepare, because we do have a bit of time. The situation is changing very, very quickly, and these slides are dating every time I work with them. Things are different. This chart here that I've got of the cases around the world at the moment look very different last week, as I'm sure all of you will be aware. And every time I'm talking about this, I want to sort of look at what are we all trying to do as a wider society. And this graph here, I'm calling this the graph of our time, I think really shows what our responsibilities are. So this version of the graph shows what happens if we don't do anything, if we don't take any mitigation steps, if we just leave things as they are. The number of cases in individual countries and areas will increase and increase until they vastly exceed the capacity of the healthcare system before they drop back down. And that's we don't want that to be happening, and that's the danger if we don't take any steps to flatten the curve of the disease. If we do that, the more we can do to prevent the spread of the disease, to contain it before it can break out in an individual area, and then if the containment fails, as it is likely to in most places, just because it's failed doesn't mean it's failed completely. It's bought you time, which flattens the curve. It pushes it out to the side, so it pushes it way over to this side, and by spreading it out over time, by reducing the speed of transmission, that brings the top of the curve down, which means that the peak impact hopefully falls below the healthcare system capacity, and that will make a huge difference in terms of lives. So my central message, and this is a basic message for anybody, not just those of us who are working in university, is don't panic, do wash your hands, and do plan ahead. This is great advice for any infection that you're facing. We should all be washing our hands more often than we do. If we keep doing that, that'll reduce the spread of the coronavirus. And that point that just because containment doesn't succeed ultimately in stopping it spreading somewhere, it's still well worth doing and still worth dealing with. And that brings me on to my next point, that about things changing very rapidly. And I noticed Enzo was saying that a week is a long time in politics, and certainly a long time in a disease outbreak. And so my next suggestion was a set of things that are immediate actions that should be in place right now. And I'm pretty sure that almost all of you will have got all of this stuff correct, and that you'll have not, I mean, you all have things like travel policy, sickness policy, and a hygiene policy for all of your locations where your staff and students and prospective students and contractors are working. But if you haven't had another close look at them now's the time to have another look at them. Chris has given you some excellent advice on your travel policy and how you can be dealing with that. Also, your sickness policy probably wants a bit of close looking at, and also consider what you might do with your sickness policy in terms of a lot of your staff very suddenly having childcare responsibilities because the schools have closed, which has happened in many places already. And then fundamentally, the bread and butter stuff is the hygiene stuff. Washing your hands, soap and water, wash your hands, very simple, but it really is effective at slowing down the spread of the virus. And also respiratory hygiene, coughing into a handkerchief. Not a handkerchief, coughing into a tissue, which you throw away in the bin. And that's and not just doing that, but making sure that all of your staff, all of your students, your prospective students, your contractors, everybody you're working with is aware of these policies and is positioned to enact them. So it's all very well telling people they ought to wash their hands and use hands, or to say that you're going to set up hand sanitizer stations everywhere. But if you get a bit of a panic buy in hand sanitizer, as we've seen in the UK, you won't be able to get hold of hand sanitizer if you leave it too late. So plan ahead and get going with these things as immediate actions. Then looking a little bit further ahead, what might be likely to happen to you if they haven't already. I know some of you probably have had very serious things in this way happen to you already. Plan for what's going to happen, how you're going to deal with individual cases of infection, confirmed cases of infection, and how you'll liaise with your local authorities about that, and what you will do in terms of cleaning and quarantining your staff and the knock-on effect that that'll have on all of your business. How you will deal with campus closures, which we've seen across the US already and likely to see elsewhere. How you'll deal with significant staff absence. The Chancellor of the Exchequer in the United Kingdom this afternoon, giving his budget speech, said that everybody needs to prepare for up to 20% of employees potentially being absent, which is a useful thing to bear in mind. But what he didn't point out is that 20% is an average and might mean that your organisation has pretty much everybody off sick. You need to plan what you're going to do if that happens. Hopefully you won't need that, but now's the time to start planning how you're going to deal with that. And also planning how you're going to deal with isolation measures, isolation policies, quarantine for all of your staff, and movement restrictions. We've heard an awful lot about movement restrictions already. In this seminar, we're going to be hearing a lot about movement restrictions over the next few months and years. And that's my final point on this thing of looking at what the impact of what might be coming to hit us. This is going to go on a long time. This is a marathon, not a sprint. This is not going to be over in a month or two. This is going to be affecting us significantly as a live issue for months and months, probably years. And the knock-on impact on the organisation is going to be very big for a very long time. So what we do about that, we need to plan what we're doing about that. Your IT people should have a business continuity plan or a disaster preparedness plan, and that absolutely is worth looking at again. You need to plan for remote working and bring those plans up to snuff and make sure those are working. Plan for much more fitness of your organisation that might happen. And now you've still got a tiny window to do some training and planning to get people engaged, depending on what the local situation is for you in terms of the virus, but in terms of cross-training responsibilities between teams so that they can switch over if there's problems, in terms of setting up and learning your remote tools so that you're familiar with online conferencing tools, that when you have the inevitable technical problems, you've got a bunch of staff with expertise in dealing with it, who've done it before, who've done a dry run when they've got lots of IT support on hand, rather than the IT support being stretched across everybody in the institution who are all working online, and in bringing people up to speed in online teaching. And as people have mentioned before, online and distance learning isn't the magic solution to this. Just for scale, the Open University in the UK takes about 2 years to develop a course and put it online, from saying, right, we're going to have this course, to the first student started. You probably haven't got that long, even if you start now. So it's going to suck, frankly, but it's better than nothing, probably. And there's lots of good advice that you can do and to bring yourself up to speed to make sure that it's not terrible. Another final point is to keep an eye out for discrimination, both in terms of your students that you're recruiting and in terms of their experience when if they're travelling internationally to host organisations, because there's been some very nasty, isolated ones. Hopefully they'll stay that way, but it's worth bearing that in mind. And my overall message is to be prepared. You can plan, you can do something, but the window for doing effective planning is beginning to close. So thank you all very much.
Okay, thank you, Doug. That's great, and really valuable and practical advice as to how we can start to sort of stay on top of this, and I think the projection of it going on into the future is one that I think we're all just coming to terms with. But it's good to have that set out for us. I'm just going to sort of do a very quick wrap up, because I want to very much leave time for questions, so that our colleagues can ask questions coming out of the presentations. So very, very quickly, just to look at some ideas from us here at SANM S4 in terms of how you can impact your recruitment for this particular intake. As Enzo said, India, we have got the advantage of having a sort of a little bit longer lead time to prepare to how we're going to approach this. When the outbreak happened in China, it hit Australia and New Zealand very, very much, because they were right at the start of the peak recruitment period for them, the start of their academic year. So I've just broken down the pipeline into some stages that I thought it would be helpful to look at. The first is outreach and lead generation. One of the key periods we're in at the moment, it started in November in India, really, for the UK and the US, a little bit earlier for Australia and New Zealand, is building up the level of interest for applications for this 2020 intake. So outside of the Southern Hemisphere, we're still in that stage of outreach and lead generation here in India, but that is being impacted. We're seeing lots of cancellations of fairs. Agent fairs are normally held at this time. Lots of those are not happening now. So we're looking at what alternatives there are. We're also seeing lots of colleagues who would normally come in from overseas not being able to make those trips. And so colleagues on the ground here are doing as much as they can to fill those gaps. So in terms of this area, looking at virtual fairs, how institutions can collaborate, can work with partners here, such as agents, to take part in virtual fairs, so that you can still reach out to those students who want to have information about your institution and your courses. If you would normally be coming into India at this time, or our colleagues here who are in offices on the ground would normally spend a lot of time reaching out, visiting agents, training, making sure that they are up to speed and up to date with all the information they need to counsel students. If that can't happen because there are travel restrictions, and this morning, for example, Kerala here in India has issued a state of emergency, therefore staff are not travelling there from many other parts of India. So in those circumstances, moving that training and that outreach onto webinars, we've introduced the opportunity for all of our staff to be able to use the Zoom platform to engage with agents and carry on talking to them, talking to students, and connecting with them online. So that's a very, very important avenue to explore. Online counselling can also flow from that. And then the other thing to think about is your website fit for purpose? This is going to be one of the key outreach tools for you. It already is, but it's going to be even more so in the coming months. So is it up to date? Has it got the right information? Have you got the ability to talk to your marketing colleagues or your whoever looks after your website to see whether or not you can have dedicated country pages for those key countries where you need to support recruitment because you're being restricted from travel? So look at what's there, what you need to be telling students, how you can use that to engage with them in a different way. If you're going to use it to communicate, or put out messages, as Chris has said, it's very, very important to make sure that those messages are consistent and they're effective and they're talking to the right stakeholders in the right way. So very, very important. Technology is not just is going to solve every problem unless you're absolutely sure of how you're using it and how it's going to work for you. But the really key area that I would suggest that that colleagues need to think about at this particular point in time is focus on conversion. If you've already got students in your pipeline, if you've already got your leads there, then start to work on those. Focus on conversion. What is your conversion communication plan? How can you move that from face-to-face to other ways of engagement? So look at your planned calling schedule. What does that look like? How can you put more resource into engaging with applicants and trying to convert them without meeting them face to face? So build online communities with your applicant groups. Again, use platforms such as WhatsApp and other social media to keep that buzz going, to keep that interest going with your potential students. Virtual conversion events and pre-departure events. Move those online, but make sure they're interesting and engaging. Bring in your student ambassadors who are on campus. Use multimedia, all sorts of creative ways in which you can make that interesting and an exciting way to reach out to your students. So they're very, very important. That focus on conversion is one of the key ways in which you can try and ensure that you are maintaining your recruitment pipeline. Again, we've put in place, we're seeing lots of interest from our clients and from other universities in how can we very, very quickly put more resource, experienced resource into this conversion work. So again, that's something to think about within your institution and look at how you can access that additional support that you need. And then finally, the final area is touching up on a point that Enzo made, is work with your partners. Keep your partners close, just not too close at this moment. Be creative with them. Use your partnerships. As Enzo said, when we went through SARS, people didn't have as many partners. We're much, much more sophisticated and we're much more connected now than we were back at that time. So look at other ways in which you can have those alternatives put in place. Online learning is, of course, really, really important, and we've certainly seen Australian colleagues move quite rapidly in that area. But it isn't easy. It certainly takes a huge amount of time to get sort of quality online course material that would replace face-to-face. Some institutions have got it already, some courses have got it, others haven't. But people will do what they can to try and use online to fill the gap. But it's also a way in which you can engage with your partners here in India. So India has recently deregulated for certain universities how you can use online. There used to be a restriction of 20%. Now it's 100% is possible. Your partners will be looking for your support, sharing best practice. So you can actually turn this into an opportunity by working with partners, sharing your expertise, look at building your partnerships much more in the cloud. So where you've had research partnerships or research engagement, invite partners to take part in your research seminars, this sort of thing. Be as creative as possible, think laterally as much as you can to make it interesting and to make sure that people are not forgetting about you because you're not able to get on a plane and come to visit them. I'm now going to stop because otherwise we're not going to have any time for questions. We do have another slide, but we can share those slides later. And I'd like to really give some time for questions. If we can't get through all of the questions, we will take those offline and respond and then share the responses. So can I...
So just for everyone's knowledge, because the attendees are on a listen-only mode, I would request all of you to type your questions in the message box there. If you want it to be addressed by a particular presenter, please do mention that in your question. Otherwise, I will read out that question and the presenters could answer it as per their discretion.
Okay. Right.
So there's one question which says, should universities at this stage be issuing blanket bans on international or domestic recruitment travel?
Okay. I'm going to ask Chris if he would like to take that question in first instance, and then other presenters may want to chip in. Chris, would you have a view on that question? Blanket bans?
I don't think we can say institutions should. I think that goes to the risk tolerance of the institution. And my institution in particular has recently said we are going to ban all student international travel that has not begun, but those that are already abroad and in a program may continue in that program if they feel comfortable doing so. I think other institutions have said anyone abroad must come home. Some institutions have not put any ban on that. So I don't think I could answer should universities do it. I would push back and say universities should consult their leadership and their overall risk tolerance and make an independent decision, which may include looking at your peers from an optic standpoint.
Thanks, Chris. I would totally agree with that. It can't be a blanket ban. Each institution must make its own decision and use all the resources at its disposal to work out what's best for them. So I think that's very sensible advice. I think I've just got one more here for you, Chris, just very quickly. Someone wants to get us to share the link to the Pulse organisation. So yes, we will do that as part of our responses for this webinar. And
there's another question on distance.
Yeah. And so I'm now going to just pick up a next question, which is, will distance learning pose a threat to TNE activity, particularly fully owned overseas institutions? Enzo, I'm not sure if you would want to take that question.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, thank you.
It's just another tool. I think one of the mistakes we make when we think about online learning is that it's all online and at a distance. Online learning is often used on campus to support student learning. So, let's not just think about it as something that you do somewhere else.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Certainly at my old university in the UK, they've moved to a model of active blended learning, where online, all courses are online, and they teach it in a very different way because of that. So I think there are lots of different models. I don't think that this will be a threat to TNE. I think, if anything, it will probably push us more towards developing high quality online, so that we've actually got the ability to move between modes as and when necessary, or when a mode would suit a particular cohort of students or a particular situation. I think this will make institutions think, what do we need to do to make sure we're not caught in this situation again, and maybe see the opportunities and benefits in having that active blended learning model available. Because I think the students that we have, they don't expect either or. They actually expect technology to be fully integrated into their learning experience. I think that's just a road that we're traveling on at the moment. This might just speed us up. So I'm just looking for another question. I think there is a question about conversion events of already admitted students leaving for university soon. What can and should we tell them to address their concerns regarding COVID-19? Doug, I don't know if you want to take that one. What should we be telling students who are about to travel in the near future? What advice should we be giving them?
I think it's a really good question, and it's an impossible one to answer in a general sense. It needs to be very specific advice and informed advice on up-to-date information about the situation in the place that the people are travelling from and the place they're travelling to, and not to. Don't forget that travel restrictions might work in multiple directions, and it may be that students become reluctant to travel from India to, say, the UK or the United States if those countries are perceived to have an uncontrolled outbreak, which might happen, and the students might be reluctant to travel there because they're worried about that happening, or they might be reluctant to worried that if they travel there, they won't be allowed to come back home when they want to. So I think the advice you need to give will change over time. And I think it's very specific to where the students are travelling from and travelling to. So I think it's a really important question, but not one that you can answer in a generic sense.
Thanks, Doug. I think accessing some of the resources that you mentioned and Chris mentioned in terms of the public health advice that is available for different destinations will be an important thing to direct students to that. And universities themselves, of course, will have hopefully a good communication plan to reassure both students and their families about their well-being if they are travelling to a campus overseas. So the next question that I'll take, and it's probably the last one because we're just about to reach our time, is one which is around, it's moved, hold on. What will the impact be on student enrolments as students might not want to travel to affected countries? How should we address their concerns for the coming intake? I think that very much is a similar answer to the one we've just given. I think that there may well be a situation where students are reluctant to go ahead with studying abroad, or may think that it's not really any longer an option they want to look at. So increased marketing and outreach to rebuild that confidence in students wanting to travel is very, very important. But being honest and putting sensible information out there and listening to their concerns and addressing them as transparently and honestly as possible it will be an important part of ensuring that we all work through this particular challenge and come out with a positive outcome. I
suggests from past events is that there will be a hit, but the hit is short term, and we've seen that across, well, my 20 years of experience, we've seen that on multiple occasions.
It all goes in cycles, doesn't it, Emma? It will come round again. I'm not going to take any further questions now because we've reached our hour. But we will take all these questions and we will respond with written answers. I'd just like to thank the presenters for their time. It's been a really valuable and interesting session. I've certainly found lots of helpful points of view and tips from colleagues. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank everyone who's linked into us. Thanks a lot. We will make sure that this recording is put out there for people who are not able to join, and we will share the slides and we will answer the questions. So thank you all very much, and we will say good night from Delhi, from Sana Mespor here in Delhi. And those of you who are at the start of your day, have a fabulous day. Those of you who are in the middle of the day, have a lovely afternoon. Bye bye now.
Thanks. Bye bye.
Bye bye.